Hello and welcome to Media Literacy Moment number 2 from the Association for Media Literacy. Today we're going to talk about lesson design, and in particular looking at learning environments in a grade 3 media literacy class. This is based on Ontario's media literacy curriculum expectations, one understanding environments as media texts. Students express their personal opinions and they respond. They will also explain how conventions and techniques are working to influence their learning by identifying elements of the classrooms. And finally, they will create or recreate an environment as part of the consolidation of their learning. This lesson has been based on 3 of the 8 media literacy key concepts. And we used the big question, if the classroom is the third teacher, how might students design their best learning environment? Remember, please, that we're working with grade 3 students, and you will find that they are fully capable of understanding and demonstrating media literacy concepts. I'm going to turn it over to June Lee, who was the grade 3 teacher, and she will show you how the lesson design worked.
All right, thank you, Neil. So for the lesson overview, basically my lesson has been broken into 3 main parts. And the first part is a pre-lesson. So in the pre-lesson, what I introduce the students to is the idea that media are made up of pictures, words, and sounds. And I wanted to challenge students to not just stop at books and posters when thinking about different media texts. In particular, I wanted to challenge them to look at environments, different environments. So home spaces, parks, libraries, and eventually classrooms. And I wanted to challenge them to think about how environments might also be a media text. And I would say, well, think about a space, think about the images, the words, and even sounds that you might experience as you're in that room. And so that would be our pre-lesson. And once we've established those key ideas, we will move on to part 2, which is the meat of our lesson. So to facilitate this part, I would show students a variety of pictures of different learning spaces. And I would ask them a very open-ended question, like, could you describe, how might you describe this classroom? And what I really want them to make note of are the different elements that create that space. So they might look at the different colors or the shapes that they might notice, or the sizes of objects, or even the texture. And then more than that, I want to encourage students to think critically about how each of those elements within that space can cause them to feel a certain way. And I wanted them to be aware of how they might personally respond to those elements in the room or that space or learning environment. And then in part 3, which is our final part of our lesson, this is the production piece. So once we've already looked at different spaces, I wanted them to think about how they might take part in designing or redesigning a space and the reasons behind why they might make those changes. So in this next section, I wanted to share with you some of the discussion points that came up as my grade 3s and I were talking about different learning environments. So in this section, we're going to show you 3 different pictures that we looked at in the classroom and some of the questions that I had asked and then some of the student responses. All right, so in this picture, I asked a very open-ended question, which is, how might you describe this classroom environment? And I would remind students, if students were stuck, I would remind them, remember, media text could be, pictures, words, sounds. And when we looked at this one, my grade 3s were really quick to say, I see a triangle, which is made up of the tables that are arranged, right, in that shape. And we would talk about how or why that might be. For the person who had arranged the tables, why did they do it that way? And then the idea of conferencing, which is when, and I would have to explain that word, what conferencing means. It's when, students are working together, right? And how positioning tables that way impacts or changes the way students might interact and behave with one another. And the other element that came up was the technology that was apparent in this classroom. My students noticed that pretty much every single student in this classroom has a technological device. And that also changes the way students or anybody in this space behaves and interacts and does their work. So we talked a little bit about that. And then I took it a little bit further, and I wanted to really invite the students into the room by asking a question. And I asked them, if you were sitting here where this student is sitting in the, you'll see in the red rectangular box, who would you most likely talk to? And the goal of asking that question is really helping to break down the actual question that I'm really trying to ask, which is, who does this classroom design encourage the students to pay attention to? So after having asked that question, I wanted them to think about how the position of where you sit and the makeup of the room, how it impacts student interactions. And when I reframe that question to, if you were sitting here, I think that has helped students to kind of pretend that they were in the room and put themselves into that position and kind of imagine how they would move around in the room and interact with other people. All right, so here we have a second picture, and I had chosen this picture in particular because there are elements within this room that is quite similar to our own classroom. And that would be the kind of clusters of tables that are put together so that there are 4 per group. And when I had shown this picture and asked the question, how might you describe the classroom environment? The grade 3s were very quick to say, oh, they're sitting like us, like our desk, except we have 4 desks. And here I see that there are 2 tables. And so then the question becomes, how does the way we position furniture impact the way we move and use the room? And so then again, this would be kind of like mini conferencing, right? It allows for collaboration and group work. And so then students begin to think about, how a design of a room is not necessarily just the colors in the room or like the paint colors in a wall, but it's also how the person designing the room is positioning the furniture, because it really changes the way we use the space. And it gets students to think about the purpose behind that design. And so the question then is, I would ask is, how is this furniture different from ours? And they would be quick to say, well, the colors of the chairs are quite different. We don't have such colorful chairs. And then I'll say, well, look a little bit closer. Let's look at those chairs. What do you notice that might be different from our chairs? And so they would look at their chairs. I would invite them to look at their own chairs in the classroom and then again, look at this picture. And then they've actually quickly identified that they see a circular shape at the bottom of the chair. And so then we would say, I had asked them, I said, okay, so what about those circles? What about those circles? What do you notice? And they would notice that, my goodness, there are wheels. There are wheels under those chairs. And so with this zoomed in picture, it really allows the students to really take a closer look at the makeup of the piece of furniture that's being used in this learning environment. And the question that I might ask is, how might wheels change the way we learn? How might the wheels change the way we learn? And they were very quick to say, well, if there are wheels on the chairs, that means that we can move around quickly. We don't have to pick up the chair. It's not as difficult to move around the room. And my question then is, well, if you're able to easily move around the room, and then I would actually ask them, what do you also notice at the foot of the table, the table legs? And they would also say, well, there are also wheels actually at the bottom of those tables too. And I said, well, if your tables and chairs can move, how does that change the way you learn? And they were very quick to say that, well, that means that we can change groups really easily. And that is very impactful to learning and how we do work together. And this is our third This is our third example of a picture that we had seen together. And I'd chosen this one because it is quite different from our learning environment in our schools. And they were quick to say, this is outdoors, because it certainly is. They see the tree next to the students. They see that they're sitting on the ground. And then I asked them, well, why might these students be outside? And they might say, well, I wonder if it's because it was really nice weather, or perhaps it was just so hot where they are. And I might even ask, like, do you think that this is the same city in which we live in? And they might say, I'm not sure. And it would be a really interesting discussion to talk about, different schools in different parts of the world. Because then I would ask, where might this be? Which part of the world might this be? And why might different classrooms occur in different parts of the world, right? So that's something that we could talk about. And another question I asked actually was, would you like to learn outside? And more than that, why? Because I think when we ask the question, would you like to learn outside? Many of our students would be excited to say yes. And the reason why I asked this question is because I wanted students to realize that we experience different media texts differently. They might not understand it in those terms, but what I really want to encourage students to understand is that when we interact with different media texts, so whether it be, a book or a poster or an environment, different people respond differently. And I wanted them to discover what it is, what elements within an environment causes them to feel a certain way and respond and behave a certain way. Because what I'm really trying to get at here is that when students realize what works for them, then they can come to a place where they can advocate for themselves. So when when given a choice, they can opt to take it. So if there was a choice to either do the work outside or inside the classroom, and if they know that it helps them to be outside, then they can advocate for themselves. And this is, it ties really well with metacognition, which is what we don't use that word in the classroom, but we are basically encouraging students to reflect on who they are as a learner. And this would be a really good example of that. So in this next section, we are some examples of how I used a few pointed questions to get students to think more deeply about the learning environment that they're looking at. So at this point, students would have been placed in groups, and each group would have been given a picture of a learning environment, and then 4 guiding questions to help them with their critical thinking and to deepen their understanding of the media text, which is the learning environment. So the first pointed question is this. I wanted students to, together as a group, look at the picture of the classroom environment, and I wanted them to think about how they might feel walking into this classroom. So, thinking about, again, also why. And I think that's a really important question, is to not just stop at how do you feel and then just stop right there, but it's the reasoning behind it. And so they might look at the different furniture, pieces of furniture, the colors, and so on and so forth, and realize that there's a correlation between certain elements that causes them to feel a certain way. So that's the first question, their emotions that are evoked. And then in the second question, I ask, how might a student be expected to learn in this classroom? Again, how do you know this? So the why behind it. I wanted them to understand when they walk into a learning space, just by looking at it, you can kind of figure out the expectations as a student, what is expected of you. And then the third question I ask is, looking at how the room is set up, what might be important to the teacher? So now we're not looking at the room from a student's point of view, but also thinking from the teacher's point of view. When teachers are setting up their room, they're thinking about the learning experience as well. And so when we look at the room, based on what we see and the elements, what might be important to the teacher? And again, how do we know this? And finally, the fourth question is, if you could change one thing about this space, what would that be? And of course, why? Why would it be important for you to make this change? So those are the 4 guiding questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some examples of student responses based on this one particular picture that this group had looked at. So this is the picture that this one group had looked at. And for us, we recognize it as like a lecture hall, but not all students have seen learning spaces that look like this, which is why this is a really interesting one. So when this group was asked the question, how might you describe this classroom environment? The very first response was, there are so many chairs. There are so many chairs, because when we look at our own grade 3 classroom, we certainly don't see that many chairs. And then when we started looking at the guiding questions, the first one, how might you feel walking into this classroom? The students in this group had said, well, actually, because there are so many chairs, it makes me a bit nervous. I feel actually a bit scared. And I had asked why does it make you feel nervous and a bit scared? And they had said, well, if there are that many chairs, that means that there's going to be that many people in the same space, and that makes me nervous to be in a room filled with that many people. And I thought that this was really interesting because it meant that the students were thinking about the implications of the number of chairs, which seems almost obvious, but it's the thinking process that was kind of that was being shared that was really interesting. Like, they were thinking about it. They were thinking about the number of chairs and what that meant, and how that space was designed so that it could hold that many people. And that was the purpose behind that, the sheer volume of chairs in that space. They also noticed that the chairs it went really far back. So because there were so many chairs, there were that many rows. And one of the responses was like, you know what, if I were to sit at the back, I don't know that I would be able to see the chalkboard, which is at the front. So those were some pretty good observations that the students had made. And in this second question, how might you be expected to learn in this classroom? Some of the students within this group said, I think that everyone's expected to sit down and do their work, and they're not allowed to get out of their seats. And I said, why do you think that is? That sounds quite strict. And they had said, well, there's just simply not enough room. Like, we can't get out. Like, the chairs are they're so close together that even if we had to get up, like, it feels like we are expected to sit there. And I was like, well, I think that makes a lot of sense based on the way the chairs are positioned. Because if we look at our grade 3 classroom, certainly there's space behind your chair, and you could easily push your chair back and you can get up and move around, right? So I thought that was really interesting that they noticed that and made those connections. And then when we moved on to our third question, which is what might be important to the teacher, the students had said that, well, we think that all the students are expected to finish their work and that they're expected to just look at the teacher. And I said, interesting that you would say that. Why is that? And again, they referred to the chairs, because they said, well, the chairs are all facing forward and they look like you can't move them. It's not like our chairs in our classroom where we can pick them up and turn them around and move them where we need to. So because of the positioning of the chairs and the fact that they're stuck, I think the teacher thinks it's important that they all teaches. So, well, I think that's a fair point. That's a fair point. And then when we moved on to the final question, this was also very interesting, which is, what is one change you would make and why? The students in this group said, well, I would have to move the screen. So the screen is also another element of this room, and it also serves a certain purpose. But this group noticed that the screen is positioned to the side. And so they're thinking about how moving the screen would be more beneficial to them as students. So they said, we need to move the screen to the middle so that everybody in the room can see, because there's already a lot of people. So some students who are sitting along the side wouldn't be able to see the screen as well. The other thing that students had mentioned is something that actually I didn't even notice when I had first looked at this picture, which is the garbage bins that are sitting underneath the screen. Now, we assume that those are garbage bins because they look like it from afar. And so if we assume that those are garbage bins, these students had said, you know what, I don't know why those are at the front of the classroom, because we can't even get to it if we were to be sitting here in this really tight space. We need to do something about that. And I said, okay, well, what would you, well, first of all, why do you think we need to do something about it? How does that impact you as a student? How does that change you? And the students were quick to say, well, you need to move it to a place where students get so that the students could get to the garbage can more easily, because every single time, if we had a piece of garbage, we would be stuck in the chair. And so in this next section, we're going to look at part 3 of our lesson, which is the redesign of a part of the school. So for this part, we actually walked around our school, so that students had a chance to take a look at not just the space, not just the learning space that they were in, which is the classroom, but realizing that our learning environment extends beyond the classroom. So we got out of our seats, went outside, and we walked along the hallways, all the floors. And what I wanted students to think about was, if they could choose one part of the school to change, what would that be? And I wanted them to think deeply about why they might want to change this part, and how they might change it. And so I had 3 guiding questions here, which is which part of the school you'd like to change, and how actually does the current design make you feel, because there must be a reason why they want to change it. And then finally, how might you redesign this part of the school, and of course, why? And the goal of this part of our lesson is to get students to really reflect as a learner and realize that they do have ability to make adjustments. And once students realize what suits them best, they can, respectfully and within reason advocate for their own learning needs. So I'm going to show you an example of a group of students who had chosen a particular part of their school, and why they wanted to make a change. So here we have a piano that's kind of parked in the hallway, right up against the wall, and anybody was welcome to play on the piano, and that was just the way it was. And so as I'm kind of listening in on the conversation, there were conflicting thoughts among the group of students, and as some students actually felt that it was distracting because anybody could go and play, and they were welcome to play on it, because they recognize that all students are different in how they learn, and some people do need quiet space. So if somebody's playing on the piano, then it's distracting. And then there were other students in the group who were like, no, the piano can totally stay. It's so nice when people are playing on the piano. And again, the piano itself is a media text, right? If we really think about it, right? And the fact that within the group, they were responding differently to this media text was really interesting. And anyway, so the students who said, nope, the piano can stay, but we would like to decorate it. And I said, that's really interesting. How would you change it? How might you paint it? Because they wanted to paint it. They were very excited about that. And they said, well, we would paint it red, blue, and green. And I said, interesting, why those colors? And they were very quick to say, well, those are the primary colors, and it's like in the playground. And I think this was a really interesting point, because they were actually making a connection naturally. These connections that they're making naturally about other spaces, other environments that they've been in. And they were thinking about parks or play structures. And they noticed that a lot of the play structures and parks use primary colors, because they're like, that's what the kids like. And I said, interesting. But of course, we also talked about how, different children respond differently to different colors. So not every child likes the primary colors. There are some children who actually respond more positively to muted colors, kind of more muted tones. And so because they feel that those colors are more, it causes them to feel calmer. And so this was a really interesting student reflection. In terms of assessment, there were 2 main things that I had used. One was focusing on the student responses and reflection through those questions that I had asked, those guiding questions. And then the second piece is descriptive feedback. And I use that quite a bit, because it's a conversation that continues to happen. And it does take a lot of time, because as the students are answering these questions, I would ask them a follow-up question just to, deepen the thinking. And I think that has been really helpful for the students, because as I ask these follow-up questions, they realize that they can, they obviously have opinion, and I'm just guiding their thinking. And the iterations do take time, but it was really, really interesting and really neat to see how through the iterations of my, questioning, they were able to kind of discover their own critical thinking skills, that they clearly have them. They just need some guidance on it. So that was really, really neat to see. And this is an example of a rubric that I had used, and I was mainly focusing on two things as I was assessing them. The first thing is whether or not students were able to identify the different elements within the learning environment. So again, the colors, the shapes, and things, things like that, that make up the design of the learning space. And then the second part that I was assessing was like how students were justifying and explaining their feelings, or the feelings or their responses as they are looking at a learning environment. So overall, this has been a really interesting lesson to deliver with grade 3s. It was not only did it hit the media literacy curriculum expectations, but obviously there was a lot of written and oral as well, written oral work that was demonstrated through the students. And of course, because students were working in groups, collaboration was huge. I was certainly assessing them on that, and also student reflection as a learner. So,
thank you, June. So we're hoping that people watching this webinar will appreciate that media exists everywhere. It doesn't have to be just electronic or just a poster. It can actually be the spaces we are moving through and that we are using every day. We're also hoping that can see that grade 3s can think critically and can understand and use media literacy. And because these students were looking in their own school with that critical media literacy lens, media literacy becomes a lifelong learning, because as those grade 3s proceed on to grade 4 and grade 5, they're going to continue critiquing their learning environment and thinking about how it can be improved. So June, I want to thank you very much. It was a very innovative lesson, and your students are very lucky people.
Thank you, Neil.